John, would you describe yourself as a landscape poet?
To a certain extent, yeah. I write about landscapes. If you mean landscape in terms of purely regional, that is that your poetry is about a place and nothing else, then no, I'm not. But my inspiration, my life has largely been based in rural areas, and so in that sort of, to that extent, yeah, I would describe myself as a landscape poet, yeah.
Some people eschew landscape as something a bit dubious as a subject for the poetry, but how do you feel about that?
Landscape's a means to an end for me. I have a love of language and also of visual things as well, and I sort of incorporate music and visual elements into my poetry. Landscape's a superb way of doing that. You can walk out into a field, you can hear a tractor, you can see it moving across, you can walk out into a forest, hear birds, see trees. At the same time, all these things incorporate, they make a poem, yeah. So yeah. It's a cross between, it's hybrid, I call it hybriding, yeah.
Are there other landscape poets, Australian or other, whom you find appealing, who have influenced you perhaps?
Certainly, very much so. You'll find that most of what I consider the great poets, most of the poets I consider to be great, should I say, to have located themselves in one spot. The transient poets, your Sendras and your people like this, tend to write always from a memory of where they left. So they travel, they go on their picaresque journey, if you like, down the river, much like Huckleberry Finn, but they write about the origins of their journey as much as where they're going. So it's like the birth thing. You're never further away from your mother than the fact that you were born. She bore you into the world. So yeah.
John, what attracts you to the Wheatbelt area of Western Australia as a landscape?
What attracts me? I suppose it's not really so much an attraction as a necessity, because most of my childhood was spent in the Wheatbelt, and you can't escape it. Once you're there, you're part of the culture. I know Les Murray at the moment is writing a book called Redneck Country or Redneck Territory, and I think the point he's trying to make, despite all the criticism he's getting for it, is that even if you don't belong to the land, which I don't believe I do, it's not my land to belong to, you can get a sense of place, and that sense of place overtakes everything else. So I could have lived in Perth all my life and I'd be called an urban poet. Perhaps it's the other way around. I lived in the country most of my life, so I'm called a landscape poet or a regional poet, if you like, a word I loathe.
Outflanked by the sheep run, wild oats dry and rises, barbed wire bleeding rust over fence posts, even quartz chunks flaking with a lime canker. The theme chooses itself, ubi sunt motif, but the verse becomes as deceptive as an idle plough, or a mass of hay spread over the ooze of a dead sheep that is the floor of the soak, blood black beneath the skin, bones honeycombed, crystallized with salt. And yesteryear, occluded by the viscous waters of the stone-walled well on higher ground, marks the dryness of the soak as either delusion or lie. Only green shoots hidden in the dead sheaves of reeds on the soak's rim hint that water supports this travesty. And the moon absorbs the sun, its fabric subtlety, the undressing of a summer landscape too blonde for its own good, too much an extract, the Midwest Gothic of a lone tree stump that appears to beckon in its loneliness, open space as collusive as a vaulted cathedral in Europe, and the well as much a receptacle of guilt as the cathedral's font. And consider the potential, consider the necessity of a flaxen-haired girl merging in this field of vision and then erupting from a point above the waterline, the tree stump.
when you've been living in other lands and landscapes, is the language of that culture something which attracts you to learn it, to...
Oh, definitely, definitely. Ignorance is bliss. I like going somewhere I don't know anything about. I don't know if that's what you mean, but I choose to travel, which I do a lot, because I constantly like to absorb things about other places. That doesn't mean I understand it, which I very rarely do, and God almighty, I haven't understood this one yet. But, you know, that's what I'm working on.
Yeah.
That will be a lifetime's work.
We work on it.
But I do like to go, and I'm a voyeur. I like to look, I like to see, I like to feel the nuances of the place.
1. A pair of painted quails scurries across the quills of stubble, a flurry of rapid eye movement. They shadow my walk ostentatiously, lifting and dropping into invisible alleyways. Reaching the grave, I turn to catch them, curving back, stopped by the windrows. The grave is a magnet that switches polarity when you reach it. 2. The epitaph is measured by the size of the plaque. Or is it the plaque that's measured by the epitaph? It seems to matter. Death becomes a question of economy. The lavish are big on ceremony, slight on prayer. 3. At a distance, sheep leave salt licks beside the dam and zigzag down towards the shade. Grey gums bend with the tide of the breeze. The midday sun would carry their doubles to the grave and fill the urns. The ground dries and crumbles. A lizard darts out of a crack and races across the paddock. Do ashes rest easily here? 4. A fresh grave that holds 3 generations is something you question on a first encounter. How in life would they have felt about sharing a single room in a shoebox flat? Maybe, at an instant, only one soul is resident, the others entering the bodies of quails, exploring the wastes of stubble.
John David Malouf has said that in order to really express a landscape, an artist needs to have the language, to develop the language or learn the language of that landscape. And he says that that is part of the explanation, at least, why it took white settlers in Australia more than 100 years before we see a satisfactory, perhaps, expression or Australianness about their expression of landscape.
Well, I agree with that statement. I think that that now people are learning the language of landscape of Australia more than they were. You said that, you know, it took them 100 years. Well, to that I do agree that, you know, they came here and there was no sort of points of reference, if you like, maybe a green field or a tree that looked the same, but there were minor points of reference, but there was no understanding of the language of the country.
There are lots of Australians and Australian writers who've learned other languages, meaning European and even Asian languages, but very few Australian writers have learned an Aboriginal language. Does that strike you as strange?
The interesting, fascinating thing about Australian 1990s Anglo-Saxon Australians or Anglo-Celtic Australians is that they've tried to suddenly borrow a past they've spent 200 years destroying. Judith Wright has said, yeah, look, you know, I've destroyed this, my family's destroyed this, but now the time has come not to resurrect it, but to conjoin with it, to combine with it.
The settler Aboriginal issue, where do you really find yourself in this kind of settler Aboriginal dilemma as to, you know, this is a landscape which we have adopted.
Very uncomfortable. That's how I found myself.
How are you working on it? Do you feel you're going in a direction which you regard as legitimate?
I regard it as legitimate because I believe that you have a right wherever you are, if you've grown with the landscape, to be part of it. And I believe myself to legitimately be part of, or say, the York-Williams run between there. That's where I spent most of my life. I regard myself as a legitimate part of that landscape. And I think that the Indigenous peoples that live there, and I can say this quite truthfully because I know many people around the area, people whose families stretch back however many thousands of years, I don't know, nor do they, and nor do they care.
No.
That if you want to become part of something and you've grown up in it and all your points of references are, you know, hey, that's a certain type of tree, or hey, that's a certain type of animal, then that's valid. So I sit comfortably with the idea of being part of the landscape and also being a valid spokesperson for that landscape. But at the same time, I also recognise that there are huge forces built around landscapes which I have no control or no understanding over, and nor do I have the right to speak about. I can only speak as an Anglo-white Australian.
Conceit and the hay rake, a rural patriarchy. The hand can but suggest. There's no touching the subject. Conceit and the hay rake have so much in common when nothing is left to the imagination. In the absence of confession, the camera and the side, depth of field obscuring the intention, details catch in the fangs of the old hay rake, old and fractious, trapped in its rusted skin and chipped nail polish. Carpe diem, it seems to say sarcastically, carpe diem. Treading carefully, you continue to prompt. Consider the light, it may be in your eye, but I need it over my shoulder. Consider your beauty, wheels that are solar systems, a solidity that defies the scrapyard. So ready. What's this you're saying? Discordia concours? Okay, don't smile, but consider anyway.
John, how far would you go in describing this here as your country?
Well, I suppose it's the country I know best, and if I'm away for a long time, I want to come back to it. I know I've mentioned to you before that overseas I get this yearning not so much to come back to Australia as to come back here, this place. So it's pretty well part of me.
John, around here is where you had the starting point for your project on the old York Williams Road, wasn't it?
That's right. It sort of started about 20 years ago, really. I wrote my first poem up here, and I decided that there was something to be done. There was always something happening around the place, and it was like a continuous narrative. And every time I came here, which was very regularly, and I'd be here for months at a time, I'd write sort of more poems and compile them. And then, of course, later on when I was going overseas and such, I was writing poems about this landscape through the eyes of another landscape. And so it sort of evolved like that. And then later on, I moved down to Williams with my brother and sort of connected the two up. The landscapes are actually very similar, but the means of my being there and the reasons for my being in those landscapes were entirely different. So that became if you like, a metaphor for dissension, and that friction is what drives the poem. So it wasn't really a conscious project, that's what I'm saying. It was one that evolved.
Can you explain what aspects of symphonic form are incorporated in the Pastoral Symphony?
A number of them. On a literal sense, it parodies Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. People have said to me, but this movement doesn't do what Beethoven's movement does, sort of thing. But the idea is it plays against it. For example, the last section of the volume is very concerned with death, and of course the last movement of Beethoven, the fifth movement of Beethoven's symphony, is about resurrection and joy and revivification. So it's a play against it. The Australian landscape isn't the European landscape, so that's one consciousness that's approached. And the other is that there's no such thing as the ideal pastoral. There never was either. And the silo as a book looks at how a landscape can only be interpreted in a particular time under particular conditions. It's not an ideal, though there are certain consistencies, and that's what allows it to have form and structure. So it plays against Beethoven's work rather than complies to it or follows it. The other thing is, of course, the landscape has many sounds, and the silo is a book about sounds. It doesn't have a consistent sound pattern to it. It's a book of
many sounds. So in a sense, although it's traditional pastoral notions that one's approaching, there's certain postmodern aspects as well about collating many different sounds and many different ideas and pulling them together in a collage, pastiche type way.
Where will you go on from here, developing from the Pastoral Symphony project?
Well, that's actually an interesting question. What it has done is that, if you like, I've done the painting and I've provided the soundtrack, and now I'm interested in exploring how notions of painting and how notions of making the soundtrack come into being. I'm experimenting with linguistic things, with the way the language is structured, and in the book that's due out, Erratum, I've approached the landscape through language, an entirely different thing, where the language itself is paramount. And Lynn Haginian, the American language poet who's written the introduction for this, talks about how the silo and the Erratum poems are exactly the same thing, just different means of approaching the subject.
What was the genesis of the project?
In my earlier books, I'd always had a section dedicated to landscape, usually the first section of the book. And after doing 3 of these, I felt that it was time to explore these ideas I've been talking about in a more, in an overall way, in an entire way, to actually put it together as a project that had a set of themes and resolutions, had a sense of closure as well. So I approached my publisher and said, I want to do a volume exclusively on these landscape pastoral poems, and I have a concept. I want to use Beethoven's symphony as a thing of counterpoint, not as the basis of the project, but as a thing to bounce against. And so they gave me free rein. Then over a period of 3 years, I collated poems from all that period I've been writing, and also went through various ideas and looked for poems, if you like. If I had a gap, I'd wait until the poem came. That didn't work very often. So I ended up with a very large manuscript I culled back. And then it came out as it did.
John, did you find that you had to come actually here, to be physically here in these landscapes working in, or were you able to work in a detached way from the city?
In various places and various ways. I find that if I'm in the landscape, like now, under this sort of set of conditions with having people film me, that will come out in a poem at a later date. It might come out ironically, it might come out as a tableau, but it will come out in some way. So what I do is I sort of collect memories, if you like, and collate things, and then at a later time I interpret them and put them together. So I'll often be in the landscape, writing the poem mentally, and not sitting down and writing it at the time, but later getting those memories and then putting it together in some way. And that would often take place in the city, or it might take place in the country, but it could be anywhere. And it could be an aeroplane at 30,000 feet. Not that I think I wrote any of the silo at 30,000 feet, but what the point I'm making is it doesn't matter where you write it. That will have an interesting effect on it anyway. It's not imperative to write a landscape poem, a pastoral poem, in a pastoral setting. In fact, quite often the juxtaposition is interesting. It allows you to view it through different eyes, and it provides that friction I talk about, that juxtaposition.
Do any particular poems come into mind from that project that really illustrate the aspects that you found yourself quite involved in?
Well, one in particular, which is probably the most abstract poem in the solo, is the Cairns poem. There are 2 Cairns poems. One's called Building Cairns, and this was also written in the same way, but the one I'm particularly referring to is in the latter stages of the book, the last movement, called Cairns, and it's written about an accident that occurred down near Williams, a car crash where a number of people were killed. It took place near a grave in which a constable was buried after his prisoner murdered him late last century, coming up from Albany to Perth. And I pulled those 2 notions together, the one of, if you like, an accidental death, and one of a plotted death. And being in the city, where those sort of things happen more regularly than in the country, there's different types of deaths in the country, but that's another story in other poems. I viewed it through postmodern eyes, for want of a better expression, and through the devices of learning that come through the academy, if you like, the concentration of learning in the city. And so that's a poem of you know, those juxtapositions and so on. It's quite a complex poem and take a long while to discuss, but that's the basic principle behind it.
Do any of the poems derive from conversations, dialogues or interviews with people living in these landscapes?
Absolutely. As I was saying to you coming up here, I think the wittiest and most intelligent people I've met have been what are classically called, in the most cliched sense, old-timers. You know, people who have been on the land for a long time, who have accumulated a wisdom, who say things with some concern. They think about before, you know, but when they say it, they really mean it. And I admire that kind of accumulated wisdom, and often there's a great wit that comes with it. So I've spent a lot of time listening to so-called old-timers. And, you know, for example, my grandmother was brought up in the goldfields of Cowan, and she's got some amazing stories to tell. And she's a very wise 90-year-old woman. But in a sense, she didn't go to a university, and she didn't do these things which apparently make us wise. So yeah, I'm very influenced by the farmers and the people associated with the region in all senses.
As you say, part of your methodology was working against the pastoral in the European tradition, but you said to me that around here we have some good stories about the conservation of the landscape, something which in many other places has been devastated by the salt erosion.
Well, with the exception of spraying, which still goes on around the place and I don't approve of, which I will say, this is an incredible place because people here were told, 30 years ago, they had a massive salt waste that spreads. You can't see it's behind those trees, and it goes for quite a distance. And it was entirely, desolate. And they started planting trees in the 70s. They've planted 70,000 of them now, and reclaiming the land. And they've done amazingly well. There's, bountiful bird life, and it's generally rich in diversity. They planted many different varieties of trees, and they've literally reclaimed that land. I mean, they will never crop it or anything, but nor do they want to. It's just healthy for the land and the land about it. So I particularly admire that, and the more positive parts of my work revolve around that idea of reclaiming what has been destroyed. There's never that sense that everything is bad. I mean, death isn't bad. If you have some sort of faith, whatever that faith may be, you see there's a positive, step, a point to move on from. And the same applies to, what we've destroyed. Surely we can, gain something from it. I mean, hopefully we don't do it in the first place, but if we have, not to say, well, that's finished with, there's always a chance that maybe we can revive something, get something out of it. And I think it's the only way you can look at the world, or else you might as well deck yourself, which I certainly considered once upon a time or two.
Rock picking, building cairns. The spine is best kept straight. The weight of granite will damage vertebrae. Stretch the spinal cord. Let the knees do the work, legs levering the load from ground to trailer dragged at a crawl behind the Massey Ferguson tractor. Cairnwoods, we move over the paddock, building these self-contained environments for snakes, spiders and bushwise architects. Ground lost is ground gained. These cairns are completely functional. Satellite cities linked by machinery that's commuter-friendly, if unpredictable. Rune stones carefully placed, oblatory, offerings for local deaths, accidents at harvest, on gravel roads, wild tractors overturning, augurs catching a hand and swallowing flesh, and deities only farmers know. Dried lichen and sweat mix to cement a cairn, the surface suppressing the glitter of quartz, pink, rose, white, transparent. Sources of warmth, these repositories of microchip technology, unharnessed, attracting infrared telescopics, blood coursing through their Frankenstein monster bodies, distracting the predator's weapon as it roams in search of foxes and rabbits. Cairns, where youths empty swollen bladders drunkenly into the fissures and cast amber bottles into cobwebbed abysses, where wild oats grow at impossible angles and lure the sun into darkness. As I rock-pick, I unravel these pictures and spread them to all corners of the paddock.
I coin phrases, devise anecdotes, invest the ups and downs of my life in these cairns constructed from the landscape's wreckage, place sheep skulls on summits. Alone, I feed these rowdy cities the stuff of my blisters, sign the structures with broken fingers, convert plans to ash and scatter them about the foundations. Softly, softly, I sing the ruins of our pampered anatomies, draw strength from the harsh realities of empire building. And following duskfall, the tractor and trailer no longer visible, I climb onto the motorbike and drape myself over the seat, a bag of bones slung over the tray of an iron jinker. As the tractor comes into focus, the cairns retreat, pyramids of the outback.